Here we go. Welcome back, everyone. And we are in the course of Fundamental Principles in Catholic Bioethics, in the program, the Masters in Bioethics, beginning, well, this is lesson 2 for the record, as we are recording. And we begin always with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your divine love. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so a few technical things. I give you feedback already on the homework. As you can see, I scribbled all over the place, and basically I'm having a dialogue with the paper there. So the things that I circle are what I consider keywords. And then when I write it on the margin or all over the place, it's either a comment of what you've written or something that's missing, right? Something that's missing that I consider was a key part. So you'll get used to doing these, and you have an opportunity to have a summary after each lecture. So eventually the grades will even out, all right? And speaking of the grade, typically everyone so far in the past 3 cohorts, everyone does very well in the scores. I think it's not, the grading is not heavy duty, but that's the scale that we use anyway, just so that you have it. It's in the syllabus, but that's the scale that we use. So we convert the percentage to a letter grade. And we also use this for the 4.0 scale for giving it a number, right? And basically, what I'll do for each course, we'll translate the percentage into a letter grade. And that just keeps adding up, course by course. I don't know if you have any general questions, or always you can see me after class if you have specific questions or comments about the homework, the summaries. If something is not clear or you disagree with what I'm putting there, just see me after class, all right? Okay. Any questions or comments from previous lecture? So I apologize for the break that we had between the two. It just happened that I had these commitments on 2 consecutive Saturdays, but now we'll go on for several weeks, several Saturdays, and there's an extra there in case anyone needs one more. All right, here we are on September 28th, and then we go next Saturday, the following, and then there's a break after October 19. We'll meet up again November 2. Okay, so you can follow along there. Also, while I'm on the schedule thing, for technical reasons, this course appears as we call Fall 1, all right? And then the other one on responsible research is Fall 2, so that I can fit it into the schedule without conflicting. But we'll go for the whole semester on this one. And then the other one, since you're doing online, just make sure you stay up with the reading on being a scientist. And then I still need to send you the link for doing those 3 modules, little certification modules from the ethics center, the ethics core at the University of Illinois. So that's still pending. But those 3 modules, they typically take about half an hour each. So it's not very labor intensive.
The modules we haven't seen, that's
Correct.
Not the discussion questions, correct, about the graduate student who's completing his thesis and something happened and what.
Exactly.
Is that what you're talking, the modules?
No, you're picking that up from On Being a Scientist.
Yes.
Right, that's separate. On Being a Scientist is like a unit in itself, that booklet, right? That small book. And there are discussions in there.
Okay.
Those will give me little summaries of that. In addition to that, the other component, the other unit of the second course is 3 modules that are embedded at the University of Illinois in the library, and it's called an ethics center or ethics core. And that was actually, that's from National Science Foundation. It was a grant, a $5 million grant that went out about 5 years ago. And we tried to apply for it in collaboration with UN. Of course, we didn't get it. Illinois got it. But because it's NSF money, it's public and for free. And so we paid for it already with our taxes. And that's why it's a great resource center, all right? But I need to send you the link for that yet and give you some instructions of technicalities, how to sign in. You have to sign in as a student, generate an account and all that. So let me write it down. Otherwise I forget. Modules. University of Illinois. Okay. All right. So just a little, sorry? No, not as such, not a separate summary. Good question on Meyer. Rather, I'll be integrating the various chapters into the lecture. Okay, so it'll be a single summary based mostly on the lecture. So for example, today, after the break, I'm going to get into Meyer's chapter 1. We'll do chapter 1 of Meyer, all right, into the lecture itself. The first part is going to be just some general concepts. We're still working a vocabulary. We're developing a vocabulary that we need in order to discuss the issues of evolution, including human evolution, all right? So I don't need a summary of the chapters of Meyer. In fact, some of the chapters we're not really going to cover. You can still read them of your own if you want to. Okay, now I usually turn off the light and we get enough there. Let's see, I adjust for a moment. And then you have enough light for writing notes, okay? All right, it's a balancing act, always a balancing act here. Okay, what I want to review, any particular questions from last lecture, focusing in, so this whole idea of origins, I'm going to be delving more into origins today. Basically, we're looking at the origin of the human person, and we can do that individually, each one of us. When do we begin? You know, the question of when does life begin? When does human life begin? That has bioethical implications when we think of the intense technology that is being used at the beginning of human life today. For example, in vitro fertilization, or one of the latest things that came out of UK, 3-parent embryo. I don't know if you've heard about 3-parent embryos with mitochondrial diseases, right? To do nuclear swaps and so forth. We'll get into all that next semester with the course at the beginning of human life, all right? So that's the ontogenetic thing. In other words, the beginning of our lives individually. But the beginning of the group as a whole, that has evolutionary implications. So when do we begin as a species, right? And how to integrate or complement the scientific data, the fact of evolution, including the human, with our beliefs as Christian, as Catholic, what we call in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that God is the author of life, including human life. How do we combine those? Because I can tell you that, you know already, many folks who are religious and faithful put evolution aside because they see it as antagonistic to a creator God, all right? And how can we, the whole thing is, how can we evolve from the monkey? Well, we don't, nor does the monkey evolve from us, because we cannot have what is known as contemporary ancestors. By definition, ancestors are previous generations. So we neither derive from the monkey nor the monkey derived from us, but we have what is known as, common ancestors, all right? We'll get into that. We're gonna go step by step, but basically this course is looking at that. It's looking at the scientific evidence for evolution, including human evolution, and how can we reconcile those facts with our core beliefs of a Judeo-Christian tradition that God is the author of life, including human life, and that we are indeed God's image. And we'll translate that into something that we can begin to understand and complement the science of this. So that's what I'm calling the phylogenetics, right? The origin of the group as a whole. So we're going to look a little bit more on the history of science today in the second part, like Meyer does in chapter 1 there. Talked about the modern synthesis, which integrates genetics with evolution, all right? And that happened as early as the beginning of last century, just 100 years ago, about 100 years ago, this modern synthesis. And that is really what propelled science, the empirical sciences today, the natural sciences, into the sophistication that we have today, including the Human Genome Project. Human Genome Project, we started in 1990. It was supposed to take a decade, so that for the year 2000, scientists would have published all of the base pair sequence of the human genome. We're talking about 3 billion base pairs. That's 3 times 10 to the 9, right? 9 zeros. Essentially the genetic code of the human. They had it right about 99.9% or 99%, but when you do 99.99% of 3 billion, you still have quite a few 100,000, if not millions of bases still missing, all right? So it had to be refined, and then it got political because part of the group wanted to make it private and sell the information. The other group wanted to have it as a public domain. And so Francis Collins was very instrumental in getting it public, and that's where Craig Venter broke off and established his own company and so forth. But so after that glitch, it took about 2 or 3 more years to have the code refined enough to the 3 billion base pairs. Of course, they only sample, it was known later, they only sampled 100 humans, and those 100 humans represent the 7 billion that we are. So there's going to be some error in that, right? But we have basically now the human genome online, and it can be mined for free and do that kind of online research. I was doing that precisely from 2001 to 2005 at Purdue. I was doing my doctorate in genetics when that was coming out, so it was a lot of excitement in the field back then. Okay. At any rate, these are tremendous discoveries thanks to those inheritance factors that Mendel was proposing back 150 years ago. Okay. So we're going to get more into this, and we're going to get mostly into Darwin's theory of evolution to give us a mechanism how we can get from one species to another eventually. And since I mentioned the keyword species, I spoke about the biological definition of species, because there are other definitions of species now that are more ecological, niche related, and so forth. So it puts the species in relation to the habitat or the niche where they're living. But Meyer was very instrumental in contributing this biological definition of species that focuses on the individual and only on the individual. It's understood that the individual is not living in thin air or in a vacuum. It's in a situation, like the Germans say, that sits in Leben, right? A situation in life, which is the environment. But the individual itself, how to define the species organically, biologically. Well, he came up with these 2 issues, that individuals that can interbreed among themselves and produce fertile offspring. So there's the inheritance aspect of it, okay? So it passes on that progeny concept, that the progeny need to be fertile to be of the same species. So the progeny is actually defining the previous generation. as two individuals of the same species. All right. Now, of course, this is very summarized, and there's a lot of intricate detail that is going on here. For example, you can think of all the hormonal control and the pheromone control, right, the sex hormones that establishes and allows individuals of the same species to recognize each other. And sometimes it's by sight, but sometimes it's by smell or by sound in the case of whales and sea mammals, because once you're in the deep ocean and you're more than a mile away from each other, you're not going to see each other, okay, but you will hear each other. And so these are all, so the songs of whales are typically to keep the pod together, and also there will be sex songs and so forth. So it's very intricate, very elaborate. It involves the 5 senses. And even with ranges that are beyond our own ranges. For example, butterflies and other insects that see into the ultraviolet or infrared, and they see flower patterns that we don't see because we're only seeing what is known as the visible spectrum, okay? And we can take flowers and we can see the pattern of a beautiful flower, and then put that flower in darkness and shine ultraviolet light, and a different pattern will come up. And some insects will see that other pattern, especially at night. So it gets very sophisticated, very interesting, but it's too much detail for our purpose, all right? Again, this concept of the biological species, we'll need this one to move forward on what we call speciation. How does one species eventually evolve into another, all right? Okay, the classification also, which was a contribution of Linnaeus. Notice the dates. This is 2 centuries prior to Mendel, and well, about 100 years prior to Mendel and Darwin. But already Linnaeus, mostly from a philosophical perspective, gives us a classification of the wildlife that is ordered and makes sense because it's by degrees of inclusion, by the characteristics that can be seen. So this is based on what we call the phenotype, which are the external characteristics, all right? The phenotype, for example, of the human, that we have 1 head, that we have 2 arms, 2 legs, that we have bilateral symmetry and so forth. That's what we call the phenotype, right? It is expressing the genotype, that the genotype remains hidden in the background, but it's nonetheless real. The genotype, essentially, the genetic code, the chromosomes. But Linnaeus, of course, did not have access to the genotype. He was looking at the phenotype. He was looking at the external characteristics and finding commonalities. For example, with the bear, all right, he will notice that the bear walks on 4 legs horizontally, so it's a tetrapod, right? And they're fuzzy, they have a lot of hair, they have more or less the same size, the same shape, they have a very stubby tail and a big snout and so forth. So we'll put them all in the same group of the Ursidae, of the bears. Now, the wolf has similar characteristics, but has a longer tail, different face, more slender in shape in general, and the wolf is looking very similar to a fox, and is looking very similar to a coyote and to a dog. So we'll put those in another category that are the canines, the canidae, all right? But however, they do reproduce by internal gestation. They carry their young inside, and then when the young is born, they're kind of delicate and premature. So the mother has these mammary glands to supply food for the child, for the newborn. So we're going to group the bears and the canines at a larger category. We're going to group them at a larger category of the mammals. See, and so on and so forth. So he made these categories from more detail to less detail, right? The more detail, the more exclusive they are. But the less detail, the more commonalities, the more inclusive the categories come. More inclusive and larger and larger. So it's a branching effect already. Is providing, if you will, a structure for the branching effect, and then Darwin puts a time lapse on it of evolution, all right, of sequential. But this framework, if you will, is the scientific classification of species, and it was also known as the Scala Natura, or the scale of the, not the scale, but the ladder of nature, which was pretty static, again, because there was a fundamentalistic interpretation of Bible, meaning that, okay, so we have a variety of animals and plants and such, but God made all these individual groups individually. So he made all the bears and all the wolves and all the sea mammals, all the whales and all the trees and so forth individually. And there was no particular relation one to another other than they shared common characteristics, all right? So that was kind of a fundamentalistic way of looking at nature, and it made peace with the Bible, but it was a static view, this Scala Natura, that was called, which translates into English, the ladder of life, the stairway of life. Okay? So on the big side of that scale, and you notice here how life is shared with an increasing variety of animals and even plants and fungi. And then the microscope, which is coming around the same time with Anton von Leeuwenhoek and other Northern European folks doing research with little lenses and finally getting some kind of a magnification. We can get into the microscopic world, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Basically, at some point, we can include all of the living things into the largest category of these domains, which we come up with 3 domains. The ones that are mostly visible are called eukarya. Later on, thanks to the contribution of the microscope, it was known that all of these eukaryans, they have a defined nucleus. The cells of their bodies have a defined nucleus, all right? Whereas these other 2 domains, the archaea and the bacteria, which actually look very, very similar to each other, except for one layer on the membrane that is missing on the archaea, then these other 2 domains don't have a defined nucleus. They may have a concentration of DNA in one region of the cell internally, but there's no membrane to protect that concentration of DNA, okay? So it's considered a more primitive state. There's less protection to the DNA itself, which means that it's more exposed to mutation, including ultraviolet radiation, heat, and other elements in the harsh chemicals that could be in the environment, all right? So anyway, we come up with these 3 large domains, the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. And within these, the eukarya then branch off into kingdoms, the protists, fungi, plants, animals. We're more familiar with animals and plants and fungi to a certain degree, but the protist is really, there's no phylogenetic reason for it. It's what we call a grab bag. Anything that doesn't fit, that is not a plant and it's not an animal and it's not a fungus, we throw into the protist bag. They're mostly microscopic, and sometimes there are single cells that start attaching to each other and they form colonies, all right? But they're very primitive that way, and sometimes they have characteristics of animals and plants together. Some may move, but also photosynthesize, which we associate with animals or plants, but not together. Maggie, you had a question?
Where do viruses fall on?
Okay, virus, good question, because it's still controversial whether viruses are living or not, you see, because one of the characteristics of life, so again, life at the organic level, right? So remember I mentioned when we talk about life in this course, in this particular course, we're not talking about the life of angels or the Trinity or saints, because that would be metaphysical. We're talking about physical, organic life here on Earth, all right? Two characteristics for life. One, that there is body functioning, what we call metabolism, and the other one, that at some level of organization, so that there's metabolism going on at the cellular level and at the level of the entire individual, if the individual is multicellular. And the other one is that that those cells are able to reproduce, okay? And so viruses don't reproduce on their own. They need to sequester, they need to parasitize a cell and hijack the replication machinery, the reproduction machinery of the whole cell in order for the virus to make more of itself. And so, frankly, many scientists consider that viruses are not really living. They're very sophisticated crystals of organic matter, meaning protein and DNA, in kind of a crystalline structure, but they're able to insert their DNA or RNA, if they're retroviruses, into a whole cell, and that has drastic implications because that whole cell now is being hijacked. Its replication machinery is being hijacked to make more viruses, and that viral DNA will even integrate into the host DNA for some time until at some point it will pop out and make more viruses, thousands or millions of more viruses in that one cell, and then make the cell explode, thereby killing the cell and contaminating, continuing with the infection. All right, so it gets very sophisticated in there and very interesting also. I'm sorry, Luis.
So, if I understand, if we apply what we learned from the first three chapters in these symbiotic components, prokaryotes and form the eukaryotes, combination in organelles and stuff, the virus will be another player in evolution, inserting its DNA in the host and potentially getting fixed and providing additional genetic material.
It does provide genetic material.
So being
absolutely. Our own DNA is full of viral fragments. You know, I mentioned the 3 billion base pair, but it's estimated that from that 3 billion base pair of nucleotides or of the human genome, only about 3% codes for proteins, right? Only about 3% of the 3 billion. What does that mean? That means that 97% of the 3 million is what used to be called junk DNA. Junk DNA in the sense that it doesn't code for any protein, and therefore it doesn't seem to have a function, because the proteins are the ones that do the work in the body, that do the metabolism, all right? They're the workers of metabolism. So those 97%, that 97% of the 3 billion, a good chunk of it, maybe 40, 50% of it is DNA, is viral sequences that are fragmented. Thanks be to God, they're fragmented, otherwise they'd be active. They could be active, right? And they're called oncoviruses, proto-oncoviruses. Some of those could cause cancer. That's the cancer predisposition that scientists are discovering now. So again, it's very fascinating, very complicated, but the real molecular story is complicated. Okay.
Is there a standard understanding of what metabolism actually is? Because
yes.
I'm thinking of metabolism as the use of energy.
Sure, there's energy involved. There's a transfer of energy from potential energy to kinetic energy. In other words, potential energy in the glucose that you provided for us this morning when we metabolize that, when we oxidize that glucose, we burn it up, we get energy out of it to do the work, for the proteins to do the work down at the cellular level, all right? And that energy is being transferred from potential to kinetic, plus heat that is lost. That's why we're warm-blooded. We produce heat that eventually dissipates out into the universe. That is entropy, right? It's no longer available for work when it diffuses out into the universe. So yes, we can look at metabolism either energetically or physiologically, the actual reactions, chemical reactions that are occurring.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because in the strictest definition, could you say computers actually use some form of metabolism in a strictest definition, that they take potential energy, electricity, what have you, produce some heat, there's some type of output?
Okay, only by analogy, because, and we can make that same statement from any mechanical machine, the car. You know, we're putting gasoline into the car and it makes the car move by way of the motor and everything else. So there's a transfer of energy there also, right? The carbohydrate is holding the potential energy, which is converted into work, to kinetic energy by the motor, but only by analogy, because metabolism, strictly speaking, only applies to living beings, which is going to involve organic molecules. And as far as we know, these things don't necessarily have organic molecules, unless they have some kind of protein code or something, all right? But so the key is going to be organic molecules. And we're going to talk about the 4 groups of organic molecules today precisely. All right, so that's part of the language that we're building. Okay, let's see. Maria, you're okay? And following up, I heard another chime. It may be Ivan. Let me open the tile a little bit for a moment. Okay, all right, you're there. Okay, so Maria, can you follow up? You are hearing okay and seeing everything? Yes, let me know.
All good.
Okay, great, thanks. Here we go. Yes, ask her to mute. And you have this option whenever you cannot make it to class, right, to chime in like that. I just send an email, check later, of the link. Just before the lecture, I send a link to the Zoom lecture. Okay, all right. So when we put together the phylogenetic, precisely looking at the DNA and percentage of homology, percentage of compatibility between the different species, we come up with these sophisticated maps or trees that we're calling the trees of life. So you see the 3 big ovals here are the 3 domains, okay? The archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. But then inside, the branching becomes much more sophisticated. And relationships that we didn't think of before are appearing, because basically this more elaborate tree of life is not based on phenotype, it's not based on the external characteristics, but it's based on genotype. It's based on the DNA, all right? For example, based on the phenotype, we see that sharks have fins, and we see that dolphins have fins, and their bodies are similarly oblong, and they're both carnivores, hunters, and so forth. So based on the phenotype, we may classify dolphins and sharks together. However, that's just the external appearance by what is known as convergent evolution, precisely, because they're living in the same medium, all right? However, when we look at their genotype, we see that they're only distantly related. Basically, the only relation between sharks and dolphins is that they have a segmented spinal cord, which makes them vertebrates, all right? From there, the sharks are fish, which are breathing through gills, for example, whereas and are laying eggs outside of their bodies, whereas the dolphins are mammals, which are gestating their young inside, are breathing by lungs, which means that the dolphin has to come up to the surface and breathe periodically, all right? And have mammary glands, which are underneath the pectoral fins to feed their young when they're born. So you can see that when we look at the genotype, it gives us a much more accurate tree phylogenetics. And so we put the dolphins closer to the whales and to us than to the sharks, even though dolphins and sharks look more similar than we look similar to the shark. Okay, you get the picture. We're going to, for now, stick with a more primitive, more simple, simplistic, if you will, classification of the 5 kingdoms, whereby the protists and the monerans, which includes the bacteria and the archaea, are mostly microscopic, and the other 3, the animals, plants, and fungi, mushrooms that we normally see with our naked eyes, those are mostly macroscopic, right? Okay. I want to move on to today's lecture. We're going to look at the existential questions and the history of science, like I said, after the break, getting more into Meyer's thoughts. But now we're going to look more a little bit at the origins, the question of origins in a bigger picture. Let's see, sorry, lecture 2. Okay. So we're going to look at what I'm calling worlds in quotations, origins, then the 4 fundamental forces in nature, physically speaking, the 4 fundamental forces, which is keeping the universe together, if you will. We're going to look also at organic molecules, precisely to answer the question, to address the question of metabolism. Then just a little bit on the primitive atmosphere, even though we're going to pick up a lot of this in the environmental course during the summer. Then species, review of species, and then the Homo group, Homo genus, at the level of genus. And then, like I say, the second half, we'll get into chapter 1 of Meyer. So without further ado, let's move forward here. What I'm calling 3 worlds, we live in 3 worlds simultaneously, though we're normally just aware of one, okay? We happen to be a very anthropocentric species that not only our own lives revolve around ourselves, but our friendships, our work, our daily living, our history, our planet, and the universe all revolve around ourselves, okay? Because we have access to study, to reflect, to think about it, to be impacted one way or another by the surrounding. So that's what I'm calling the normal macroscopic world. Essentially, what we can see from the smallest thing that we can see, let's say a hair, to the largest thing that we can see, which is the stars on a moonless night, for example. All right, from the smallest to the largest with just the naked eye, without any technological enhancements. This would be the normal macroscopic world, and mostly the eyes, because it is said that the vast majority of our information in the brain comes through our eyes, even though we have the other 4 senses, right? But the eyes are the ones that pick up most of the information. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican theologian in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, 1200s, 12th century, 1100s, he would say that nothing is in the soul that has not come in through the eyes, or sorry, through the senses, All right, so that's our normal world where we experience the reality around us on a daily basis. But there are also two other worlds that are just as real, and we're normally not aware of them, not consciously, constantly, but they're very real, and they have a real impact in our lives and in our evolution. The microscopic world, all right, all the way from microscopic organisms like remember the amoeba, the paramecium, the euglena, all those guys, all the way down to the molecules that make those creatures, the atoms that make those molecules, the subatomic particles that make the atoms, and the subatomic particles that's at the level that we're at right now with the instrumentation, what is known as the quarks, the level of the quarks, all right, of the world of the quarks, which gets us into quantum mechanics. And that's the level of sophistication that we've reached, the level of smallness, if you will, all in search for the unitary particle, right? And the idea about this is that that takes instrumentation, increasingly complex instrumentation. We can go all the way from the primitive early microscope of Leeuwenhoek, which was a little lens. Well, I can show you. The internet can show us. It's not the proper spelling, but this machine will correct it. I always have difficulty with this spelling. Where was, oh, you can buy a copy of it. I just wanted to see, yeah. He spans between the 17th and 18th century, okay? 1600 to 1700s. So these are it, and you can buy a copy of it now. You see, it's mostly metal, but in here, embedded in there is a little lens, okay? And then it has this point, right? So here's a diagram. There's a lens here, and you would put the specimen on this little point, bless you, right? Little point here. And the idea was that with these little levers, one could, they're basically screws, one could move that little point around, either up or down, sideways, or in and out, so three-dimensionally, right? X, Y, Z, that's why it's got 1, 2, 3 levers. And with those 3 levers, he could move that point from the lens up, down, sideways, or in and out, and essentially get it to focus on the point. Very ingenious, very simple, primitive for us today, but that started the microscope, all right? And yeah, that's the size of it. There you go, that's the scale, thank you. I should incorporate that. Yeah, so he was really into it, and it was a big time of lenses, how lenses are getting smaller and smaller and more sophisticated. The Northern Europeans, the Belgians, the Dutch, Scandinavians, they were getting into that. From that to some of the microscopes that we have today that can actually see molecules and atoms. Right. Extremely, the electron microscope, we look at the, these are atoms, okay? Look at the structure here. See, this is an actual photograph, 3 Armstrong units. And this is the chemical equivalent. Armstrong is what, 10 to the minus 12, is it? So in 100 years or 200 years, 300 years, we've gone from that very primitive lens. He was fascinated. He would take buccal swabs of people and the teeth, because there was no toothbrush back then, and the fauna that was accumulated on teeth was just spectacular, right? And I remember reading a little book once my parents gave me when I was a kid. It was called Hunters of Microscopic Bugs. And one time he saw an old homeless guy sitting on a bench in a park, and obviously this fellow had never brushed his teeth, and he asked if he could take a swab of his teeth and look at it in the microscope. He was fascinated by the jungle of germs that he found there, okay, just crawling around, and you can actually see them moving around slightly and so forth. So it was just fascinating to him. Those are some of the anecdotes of early science in the macroscopic world, right? So we know it's a whole universe in there, a whole universe in the macroscopic world. Thank God they exist, otherwise we'd be buried in trash, in just organic decomposing matter, decaying matter, that would be, I don't know how many feet or miles high if there wasn't for these bacteria that are around decomposing everything that starts rotting. Then on the other scale is the super microscopic world. Excuse me. Basically, when we go beyond our planet into the solar system, the scale is so large and so huge that it's very deceptive. For example, when we look at the night sky full of stars, all right? A starry sky, let's say. Probably spell it wrong. There we go. Most of what we're seeing here, okay, we look at a starry sky. Most of what we're seeing, we say they're stars. Well, the big dots are probably planets, and the little dots are probably entire constellations, most like constellations, okay, which involves millions of stars. A star is a sun, our sun is a star, okay? And most of what we see at night, aside from the moon, is either the big dots, those are planets that are reflecting the light of the sun, just like the moon is. And the little dots are typically entire constellations made up of millions of stars, millions of suns. Why do they appear as a single dot? Well, there's that old experiment of taking two flashlights in the night. And at first, so we need 3 people to do that experiment. We're standing here and 2 colleagues are over there with flashlights facing us, all right? And they're, let's say they are 6 feet apart, 2 meters. They're gonna walk away from us. Over distance, those 2 dots of the flashlights are gonna start getting closer together. It's called perspective, right? A 1-point perspective into the infinite. So the 2 flashlights seem to be coming closer together. If they go far away enough, they merge into one. It's a perception same because of the point of view, it's called a 1-point perspective, right? And they fuse into one if they go far away enough. Well, that's the case with these constellations. Those constellations are so far away that they seem as a single dot, but they're not. And then the streak here in the middle, that's our own Milky Way. We are embedded, our solar system, right? Is embedded into one of these constellations called the Milky Way, and these are the other suns that are the millions of suns that form the Milky Way that can be seen as a nebula streaking through the sky. So that's the macroscopic world, or the super macroscopic world, that is deceptive because it is so huge, and the scale there is typically the scale is what is known as a light year, which some people confuse a light year into a measure of time because it's got the word year in it, but not. It's not a measure of time, it's a measure of distance, right? And how much is a light year? The number is, so it's the distance that a photon, that a light particle travels in a year's time, okay? Because a light particle is extremely fast. It's about 300,000 kilometers per second, all right? 300, so in 1 second, what's a second? 101 is a second. The photon that just left us here is now 300,000 kilometers away. We will put it in miles, round it up to half, it's 1.6 kilometers per mile, but we can make it 2 for the ease of computation, so it's 150,000 miles away. Let's say we let a photon go right now, light beam, 101, in 1 second, it is 150,000 miles away. In 2 seconds, 300,000. You do the math, 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, 24 hours in a day, 365 days in a year. You do all those multiplications, it's the trillions and trillions and trillions of miles that photon traveled in a year. That's 1 light year. And the measurement of the universe between stars, between galaxies, is measured in millions and billions of light years. So it's mind-boggling. You know, to wrap our minds, like I say, around that number is just an exercise in itself. It's exhausting. But that's the super microscopic. It's very real. It's there. You know, we normally don't think in those terms, but it's very much there. Okay.
Do we think of the ocean in terms of the normal macroscopic, or is it
Yes.
super macro?
No, we can see it. It's not super macro at all. It's not super macro. It's macroscopic normal because we can see it. We can immerse ourselves in it. You know, it's there. But within the ocean, certainly, there's the other world, living the other universe, the microscopic, right? The microscopic is in the ocean for sure, big time. That's where the estimated 90% of the species we have yet to discover may be.
Pretty amazing, Father, that it seems like we're approaching the limits of both the microscopic and the super microscopic. Like we're getting to the point when we cannot determine particles specific in position, but just
Statistically,
yeah. Or energy. And on the other hand, we're approaching the Big Bang moment in the creation of the universe.
Right.
And we're getting there with different techniques.
Exactly.
But in our own world, in the plain sight, we have plenty to discover.
Yes.
Like the ocean.
Exactly.
The ocean.
Exactly.
And
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
it's very sophisticated. The equipment that is needed on both sides, right? Less sophisticated for our own equipment, to live in our own world. But certainly, yeah, there's a lot to discover. So really, these worlds, they can be universes. I didn't want to use the term universe as such because it has more specific meaning, more technical meaning. But yes, you're right. The technology is taking us there. And we're the only ones who have it. We meaning our species. You know, so it's fascinating. I have a friend who used to teach here, a colleague, very dear friend. He's an astrophysicist from MIT, and now he's working with NSF. He's running the NSF program on astrophysics and astronomy. And they're building a super large telescope in Chile, up in the Andes mountain range, because the air is very thin there. There's less interference with the atmosphere and so forth. I keep mentioning NSF, National Science Foundation. It's the largest funding organization for science in the world for non-human. And the equivalent for the human is NIH, National Institutes of Health, all right? And they're both in the United States, and their budget, like NIH budget last year, I think was $13 billion or something like that. It's just huge. NSF also. These are the 2 largest funding agencies for science in the world. And why do we build satellites, you know, and telescopes that are like the Hubble and so forth that are in space to the tune of millions and millions of dollars? is what is known as basic research. We're not getting anything immediate out of it. Some of it can be involved in communications for sure, the thousands of satellites that are going around the world. Some of it is security and all that. But the other is just basic research, curiosity, the human curiosity. We want to know. We want to know. And so there are a lot of resources that are devoted into this just because the need to know, all right? And how to balance that with other real needs that we have here on Earth that involve the real life of people, like healthcare and so forth. So these are the challenges that have a bioethical implication. But yes, the sophistication on both sides is a lot due to technology. So we can look at these three origins, right? The origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of the human. Those would be three big origins where, at least from a belief perspective, we would like to see the hand of God in those, all right? And I can tell you that at least from the perspective that I'll be teaching and according to what I'm interpreting as a Judeo-Christian tradition, we may see the hand of God in the origin of the universe and the origin of humans. But we can pretty much come up with a biological, a biochemical explanation from the origin, for the origin of life. All right, from inorganic molecules to organic molecules, and from organic molecules assembling into an organized way to actual life. In other words, metabolizing and reproducing. We're going to get there. All right. So again, this is an overall because we're going to go into more detail on this either in the environmental course in the summer or in the beginning of human life next semester, or further on in this particular course, okay? Like the origin of life itself in this course, and the origin of the human species also in this course. So we can look at the origin of the universe about almost 14 billion years ago. Important to become familiar with the numbers. When we're dealing with numbers, we use a scientific notation, all right? So a scientific notation has always a unit number, which is from 1 to 9. The unit number is going to be from 1 to 9. Then it will be multiplied by an exponent, by a factor. And the factor is base 10. So 10 times 2, 10 times 10 to the 10, 10 to 10 cubed, 10 to the third, 10 to the fourth power, etc. And this is how it's represented if you want to just write it in a single line without having to use the superscript and the subscript or your word processing. You can just write in a single line. You have the integer unit, which is going to be anywhere from 1 to 9, okay? Then an X and 10, the base 10. And then the tick, this, I think this is called the uptick, right? Uptick, which is shift 6 on the computer, all right? Uptick, and then the next number after the tick, that is the power. So that's to the 6th power. And that power basically means putting zeros on the 10, okay? Putting zeros on the 10, but including the 10 is one of those zeros. So for example, 10 to the 6 is how much? 1 million, which is 1 and 6 zeros, okay? So remember that the 10, the 0 on the 10 is one of the zeros counted in the 6, in the power. So 10 to the 9 is a billion. And it's how many zeros? It's 9 zeros, it's 1 and 9 zeros. Use the commas because that helps to aggregate, all right? The commas denote thousands, units of thousands. But the other thing I wanted to point out that this number, we use it around, we use it for the economy, we use it for people, 7 billion people in the world and so forth. This number is actually so large that we don't even agree on the name for it. Because this is a billion in the US, this is an American billion, 10 to the 9. But in Europe, 10 to the 9 is 1,000 million. In Europe, a billion is a million million. So it will be 10 to the 12. That would be a European billion. All right?
Not only in the scientific world,
No, it's in common parlance.
so like even financially there would be?
Right, billione, trilione, well, yeah, so they go to the scientific notation when they want to, yeah, it's amazing, but it can get very, yeah.
The numbers are complete, I mean, those values are totally and
Yeah,
utterly
by a
different.
thousand, by a unit of 1,000, it's off.
All of a sudden, our debt doesn't look that bad.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right, if it's in the billions, it's only for the thousands of millions for the Europeans, okay? And that's precisely why we use scientific notation, because there's no mistake about 10 to the 9. Mhm. So I'm just saying the numbers, and then trillion, they go every million is another, you know, a billion would be a
But
million.
Father, the calculations, if somebody used them, would be different. I mean, if you're, if you did an experiment in the United States, whatever, in the United States,
Right.
and use that number, and you're saying that 10 to the 9th is a billion.
Well, in the scientific, if it's a scientific article, they would have to use a scientific notation.
Didn't you say it was different for
The word, the actual grammar word, billion,
the word is different.
the grammar word, but the value has to be the same. Okay, so
Okay.
10 to the 9 is the same for us than for the Europeans. 10 to the 9 is always 10 to the 9. That's universal. But the word billion for us
Okay.
is 10 to the 9. But for Europe, 10 to the 9 is not called a billion. It's called 1,000 million. And in fact, in Italy in particular is the one I know, they has a word, and probably France also, miliardo. So they have milione, which is a million. They have billione, which is a trillion for us. And they have miliardo. And I suspect that in France also, milliard, right? You can anglicize it, francicize it. But just the word itself. But the notation is the same value, of course. What I'm trying to point out is that these numbers are extremely large, really. And just to count to million, how many hours would it take if we just counted sequentially? All right. Not going to do that exercise, but I pointed it here. It takes, on average, if we count a number per second, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it will take between 4 and 5 hours just to count to 1 million. All right. Okay, let's move on from here. I just wanted to point out that these numbers are huge, but they're not infinite. They're real. It's an actual number. It's under 14 billion, under 14 billion years, like 10 to the 9, was the origin of the universe. Which means that if we go back in time, hypothetically, before 14 billion, there's nothing. There's not even empty space, because empty space is part of the universe. There's nothing, nihilo. So that's where we get the God thing, ex nihilo, from nothing, something. All right? All right, so hang in there. We can put a number now, going backwards. And how can we put a number to the origin of the universe? Because of the expansion of the universe. And that was the big contribution of the Hubble telescope. Finally, when we got it out into orbit, the scientists, they noticed that over time, the stars or the constellations, the galaxies were getting further from each other. And the only logical explanation of that is that the universe is expanding with time going forward. Then a simple mental exercise, if we reverse time, go backwards, then the universe would be shrinking. And where would it shrink? It would shrink to a single unit, what is known in physics as the moment or the point of singularity, a single dimension. Not three-dimensional, not two-dimensional like a sheet, right? But a single point, a definition of a point, which is not a dot, but a point, which is the moment of singularity. The origin, the very origin. Within those 13.7 billion years, our Earth appears, congeals to a mass that is defined enough to be a planet about 4.5 billion years ago. So fairly recent in the history of the universe, fairly recent in the history of the universe. Only in the last third of the universe does the Earth appear. And fairly soon after that, even though it was a molten ball of fire, of liquid rock, we get life. As soon as we get crusts that are cool enough to have water, we get life. And so life has been traced back to about between 3.9 to 4.1 billion years ago, almost toward the origin of the universe. Okay, we'll get more into that in a minute. First, I want to talk about these 4 forces staying still with the universe when it's holding the universe together, if you will. So far, the scientists, mostly physicists, have been able to narrow it down to 4 fundamental forces. Okay, fundamental forces. Now, we call them forces because we really have no idea what they are. We can call them mysteries, or we can call them entities, but to give it a name, we call them forces. And these are the 4. The first 2 are mostly microscopic, so microscopic that they're holding the atom together. And the other 2 are at the macroscopic level, so macroscopic and large that they hold the universe together. All right? So, for example, the strong force is what holds the core of the atom together, the proton. I have to be careful with myself here not to get too excited about this. Let's do this because we're still at a very early stage and we're going to cover this in more detail. Let's just say that the strong force is holding the atom together. It holds the protons together to form a nucleus in the atom. All right, so the strong force is holding the atom together. The weak force has to do with the decay of the atom from one isotope to another, from one radioactive, yes, the radioactive decay. All atoms have some kind of radioactivity or some kind of decay. Some are extremely fast in decay, a few seconds, nanoseconds, and some are extremely slow, billions of years. But all atoms have some kind of decay. So at the atomic level, atoms can pass from one to another if they lose the number of protons in the nucleus. And that may be influenced by the decay of the electrons or the neutrons that are also in the nucleus. So
we still talk about neutrons and electrons?
Yes, the standard, that's a good question. The standard atomic theory, all right, what is known as the standard model in physics, the standard model is still the atom. So it's the basic, it's a stable unit of matter. A stable unit of matter is the atom, which has the 3 classical particles, protons and neutrons in the nucleus, in the core, and then electrons orbiting around. I should show you. Just a picture says 1,000 words.
So one question.
Yep.
So the strong force will be not at the subatomic particles that make up an atom, but the atomic bond, or
no, it's subatomic because
subatomic. Okay.
Yeah, let's look at this for a moment. Yes, okay. You'll see a little more clearly. It will snap in, you'll see. So this is a simplified caricature of an atom, all right? That has 3 different types of particles, each one in a different color. The black or dark gray is the electron. And it's your pick. The 3, let's say, well, it's got, all right. 3, let's match the electrons to the protons. So let's say the protons are the red, 3, okay? And then the blue, these 4 blue, those are called neutrons. And that's a reference to their charge. The proton is positive, the electron is going to be opposite the proton, so the electron charge is negative, and the neutron, the word says it, is neutral. So for a mnemonic, if you want to just remember it, if you associate proton positive proton, all right? Then the electron is opposite, it's orbiting, has to be the opposite charge, negative. And the neutron is hanging around with the proton, no problem, so the neutron is neutral. But together, proton and neutron form the core, which we call the nucleus of the atom. Just very basic review from high school stuff, but it's going to be relevant. What is the red particle? Proton. We're calling it proton, all right? And what's the charge on the proton? Positive. Now, from our elementary school experiments with magnets, positive and positive, do they attract or repel? Repel. Normally, like forces repel, right? Remember playing with the little magnets? All right, and then opposite forces attract. All right, so what are these 3 protons? And there's probably one in the back that we can't see, but what are these protons doing in the nucleus, hanging together if they're all positive? Wouldn't they be flying out from each other? That's a strong force that is holding them together. It's called strong force because it is stronger than the repulsion of the protons. It is so strong that when we break that, we cause a nuclear bomb. That's how strong it is. But as strong as it is extremely narrow it can only exert its force in an extremely narrow range, which is basically the size of the proton. If we manage to get that proton, those 2 protons away from each other, another proton equivalent, the strong force cannot exert its force any longer. I don't want to say disappears because it's still there, but cannot exert its force anymore, cannot hold the 2 protons together. As long as we are able to separate those two protons 1 diameter's worth, then it's gone.
Is that what's called splitting the atom?
Yes. Nuclear fission, right? Nuclear fission. Fission is division. Fusion is coming together. All right? That's a nuclear fission. That's a nuclear reaction. That's a nuclear explosion. So that force is so strong that it's keeping the atoms together. And atoms together gives stability to everything that is material. So that everything is not just exploding.
But the source of that force is would not be dependent on, well, it's measured versus the charge repulsion. But
Yes.
What would be the kind of force? It is based on mass, or
That's the mystery.
that's the mystery.
That's the mystery. That's why I'm saying these 4 forces are 4 mysteries. They can do the math on it, you know, but there's no explanation yet of why the protons hang together. We're just calling it, it's a strong force that is holding them together. And if we look at it from that perspective, it works. The math works on it. I don't know how many gigatera-tons it is of power, but it's there. And when we split the atom, we see the results.
So the strong force is holding the protons together, or
Yes.
the protons and the neutrons?
Only the protons.
Only the protons.
Yes.
What is
The weak force.
The what?
The weak force.
The weak force.
Basically, the weak force are holding the neutrons together, but it's weak, and therefore it decays. And therefore the atom can lose neutrons much more easily, right? And still remain the same species of atom, the same element, because it's the number of protons that defines the element, right?
So the weak force holds the neutrons to the protons
Holds the neutrons in the nucleus.
in the nucleus.
The nucleus, so the neutrons and the protons are not interacting energy-wise or charge-wise. Why? Because the neutron is neutral. It's like trying to magnetize plastic. Not gonna work. can magnetize metal, but not plastic. But the thing about the neutron is it does have mass, significant, what we call significant mass. And so the proton, and that's why they're hanging out in the nucleus, because both neutron and proton have significant mass, all right? The electron has what we call an insignificant mass. So what's important about the electron is its charge more than its mass. And that's why we can't really determine exactly where, and this is where this model becomes a caricature. We cannot determine exactly where the electron is. We only can determine the probability of where the electron is because it's spinning around the nucleus so fast. And it has insignificant mass. So how do you detect it with insignificant mass? It's just the charge. But the charge is moving so fast that it basically generates a negative shell around the nucleus. And that's what we call the orbit. And then depending on how many fit in that orbit, when that orbit becomes full, it has to go to another orbit. And the distance between those different orbits is always discrete. It's always the same for whatever element. Very interesting. That gives us the periodic table of elements. So you can see the periodic table up there, and I'll project one here in a minute. Let's try this. Okay, periodic table. The numbers, one with numbers, here's one with numbers. Can you see that? Now I got a little fuzzy. I guess I made it too big. Oh, here it is. Here, okay, thanks. There we go. All right, so you can see the numbers, right? Number one, the number refers to the number of protons in the nucleus, all right? So the proton is always going to be in the nucleus. So hydrogen has 1, and it will have 1 electron going around, helium, 2, lithium, barium, boron. Here's carbon already, 6. Nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon, etc., etc. Natrium, which is sodium. The number is known as the atomic number, and it is the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom. So when we change number of protons, we change element from one element to another. The neutrons hover, the number of neutrons hover around the number of protons, but it can vary. A little bit more, a little bit less. So you can have 6 neutrons, you can have 7 neutrons, you can have 5 neutrons, right? And that makes that element more or less radioactive. And those are what we call the isotopes. They're siblings. The isotopes are siblings of the species, which is the element. So you got carbon 12, for example, is what we call the non-reactive carbon. The 12 is a reference to its mass, has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so that's 12. But there's carbon 13 and carbon 14 in particular that is radioactive because it has still 6 protons. Why does it have 6 protons? Because it's carbon. So it's the protons that determine the species, the element. But it has 8 neutrons. It has 8 neutrons. But those neutrons are more weakly associated and can be lost over a period of time, 14,000 years, all right? And that's the decay, so that's the weak force there, all right? I'm giving you very, very simple explanations. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a nuclear physicist, I'm not a quantum mechanics guy, but that's where it's going. The real experts can get into it mathematically, formally, they can formalize it. You know, they can put a mathematical formula to it, and it works. So those are the 2 forces. You can see that basically these 2 first forces, the strong and the weak force, are holding matter together, including organic matter, because organic matter is made by molecules. all right? Particularly molecules of carbon and hydrogen. The other two forces are on the big scale, on the opposite end, on the the super microscopic world, all right? Electromagnetism, which is 2-in-1 in a sense, you can see it has two, because any electrical current will generate a magnetic field around it that is perpendicular to the motion of the current. So if we have a wire and we put electricity through it, you notice that there is directionality in electromagnetism. Yeah, the electricity is flowing from one pole to another, you know, and the electricity will flow through the wire, but at the same time, simultaneously, that electricity is flowing through the wire, it is also generating a magnetic field around it, which is perpendicular and circular, if the wire is circular, around. So the wire at the same time will be charged with electricity and will have a magnetic field around it. And that is what causes a rotor to work and the electric motor. The electric motor. When that wire is coiled around into a ball and the electricity is put through it, it will make the motor spin, because the electricity is, if you will, the fuel, but what is actually making the electric motor spin is the magnetism. It's the magnetism that is rotating around the ball of wire. So electromagnetic field, these two are fields. So the first two can be seen as particles. The other two can be seen as fields. Again, in the field of quantum mechanics and astrophysics. And then finally, gravity, gravitational pull, is extremely large, if you will, has an influence over kilometers, miles, and they're talking now even within light years, gravitational influence. But of course, with distance, it dissipates. What is holding us here together? Why is this book not flying away and this desk, and why are we not flying away? Gravity of the Earth, but that's only one of the gravities. It turns out that every matter exerts gravity. It's just that the strongest gravity, or the strongest mass, the most dense mass on Earth is Earth itself. And specifically, the center of the Earth, which is known as the core, which is a ball of solid iron that is white hot, beyond red. When you get a stove that's red hot, that's pretty hot, right? Okay, when I used to smoke many decades ago, I used to light a cigarette. If I didn't have a lighter, I would light a cigarette with a red hot stove. Okay, white is beyond red. You keep heating that stove, it won't happen under normal circumstances, thanks be to God. But with sophisticated equipment, a metal can be taken beyond red hot to go white hot, meaning that that metal is now emitting, is glowing, okay? And it's emitting photons, which to the eye look white. And what's an example of white hot metal luminosity? The old bulb, the incandescent bulb. Remember the old bulbs that used to get hot? You can hold it because it got hot. All right, that little filament would get white hot, white. And that was giving off photons and making light in the room. Now these are being replaced. Now we're in the third generation. Second generation was neon lights, which were cooler. The gas would light up and emit photons and produce a light, all right? But now we got into the LEDs, light emitting photon, all right? A diode, light emitting diode, which is a chemical basically that with very little electricity, with very little energy, emits photons. And so now we're to the LEDs, which is the latest in technology. They last a long time, they're expensive, and they're extremely efficient energy-wise. If you're renting, then it's a risk to rewire that, to re-illuminate your house with LEDs, because if you move in a year's time, you leave all the bulbs, and the bulbs will last 10 years. So you're giving the bulb to the owner. But if you're buying, then you're better off with LEDs because they'll last you longer and save on the electric bill. Okay, so this is just basic review. We're going to be using these languages. Oh, just talk a little bit more about gravity moving forward. The greatest gravity on Earth is the Earth itself, the core of the Earth, which is keeping everything else in place, including ourselves. But there's another body flying around us, rotating, which is the moon. And the moon also exerts gravity, its gravity, because it has density on Earth. And one very significant influence of the moon's gravity on Earth is the tides, And essentially, you can think of it this way. The moon, when it's traveling over the oceans, is pulling the ocean, is pulling the water toward itself. It's creating a bump, generating a bump of water toward the surface, which is the tide. And the tide will move with the moon with a little lag because of the physics involved. And so when that tide, when the moon goes over land, then that tide breaks into shore and causes a high tide. All right? And then as the moon moves across the surface of the land and eventually comes out to the other ocean, let's say it started on the Atlantic, made the high tide over here for us in Miami Beach, and then moved across the United States, and now it's going out from California into sea, is going to pick up water from the Pacific, pick up a bump of water, and move it across. So it's going to cause a low tide in California and take that bulge of water across the Pacific and dump it onto Japan and Asia over there, the east coast of Asia, and cause a high tide over there. And that's the moon. That's the tide, which on the Atlantic, because it's smaller, has only one tide a day, but in the Pacific, because it's larger, actually produces 2 tides a day. But that's not the only water that the moon has an influence, on which the moon has an influence. The moon has an influence on all water on Earth, and so much influence that it actually has the reproductive cycle, the ovulation cycle of women is actually 28 days, which coincides with the lunar calendar. And it has an influence to that exert. It has an influence, the gravitational pull of the moon has an influence on the water of the metabolism to the point of regulating mammalian ovulation. It's amazing. It's and then beyond that, the planets also have a gravitational pull with each other. And because we don't have actual circular orbits around the sun, but we have elliptical orbits, there are times of the year when we're closer to the sun and times of the year when we're further away from the sun. And that happens not only with the Earth, it happens with the other planets too. Neptune, Pluto, Mars, and everyone else. And we are more or less aligned in a plane, but orbitally, some of those orbits get closer to each other, and sometimes we're far away from Neptune, and other times we're closer to it. And each planet is exerting gravitational pull on each other on a large periodic scale of years or decades or centuries or millennia. And so this thing in astrology of the planetary alignment may have some truth to it, that they really did not have a physical explanation. They did not have an astronomical explanation for it, but they were measuring the effects of those alignments, all right, in their primitive observations of nature. Anyway, what I want to say is that the gravitational field all around, and that's actually what is generated in the plane, and the matter and photons, the particle quality of photons, of light particles, travels through those gravitational planes. And that was one of Einstein's contribution to physics in his theories of relativity, general relativity and special relativity. If we have time, we can get more into it in the environmental course. It's very interesting, some tapes that I've been listening. He used to do experiments in the brain, you know, having elevators falling or rising, moving, accelerating into space. He would do these mental experiments and come to some conclusions. And then years later, he was a theoretical physicist. And then experimentally, when the instruments caught up with it, they would verify those experiments that he was making in his brain, in his mind. It's just amazing, very interesting. So anyway, these forces are there. They influence us, and we call them forces because basically they're a mystery. And they work out with the math. We don't really have an explanation why at that close distance, photons can stay together. And why over light years of distance, planetary systems and galaxies can have influence on each other. And actually keep whole millions and trillions of planetary systems kind of moving in a pattern, those typical patterns of galaxies that we see swirling, right? Let's get back to the middle world. The origin of life, about 3.9 billion years ago. I saw some recent research that moved it back a little bit to about 4.0, 4.1 billion years. Now, what is the origin of the planet as such? The origin of Earth? Of Earth, 4.5. Of the ball of fire that we call Earth, all right? When it was still congealing, when it was still, that's a technical term. Anyway, so there was no possibility of life because there was no liquid waters. The only water that was available was vapor. And we need liquid water for metabolism, precisely. So when it cooled down enough to have liquid water, life began, pretty much. Very interesting. Of course, at the microscopic level, all right? In a couple of lectures, we'll get into that. All right, so again, just reviewing some basic concepts from high school and so forth. Organic molecules. True metabolism, body functioning, life, all right? Metabolism has to do with organic molecules interacting with each other in an organized way. So we have a series of chemical reactions that are controlled chemical reactions, namely within the cell. That's what we call cellular metabolism. Cellular metabolism can also be divided into two great categories, either anabolism or catabolism. You don't need to know that much detail now yet, but anabolism is building up. So ana builds up and kata breaks down. All right, so the building up of molecules, for example, making proteins, that's anabolism. The breaking down of proteins, the breaking down of carbohydrates, that's catabolism, right? So basically metabolism can be seen at the molecular level as either making molecules or breaking down molecules. Those molecules are going to be of four types. And this is what we call organic molecules. They're going to be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, or nucleic acids, all right? Carbohydrates, we're very aware of the carbohydrates, the sugars, the starches, cellulose. There are long chains of carbon filled with hydrogens around them. Lipids, another word for lipids is fats, oils, grease, lards, soaps. Those are all lipids, all right? That's a fancy name for fat. Proteins, we're familiar. Proteins are made up of little building blocks called amino acids, of which there are 20 in nature. And the nucleic acids are either DNA or RNA. Again, we're going to look at them more in detail later in this series, or also we're going to pick it up next semester with the beginning of life. We'll start with the DNA molecule. These are known as macromolecules because in contrast with, let's say, what's the chemical formula for water? H2O. So how many elements in water? Exactly, oxygen and hydrogen, right? And how many atoms? Three. 2 plus 1. So H2, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. When it's 1, the 1 is implied and is not written. Anything that's not 1 is written. All right, so water molecule, 3 atoms. How about carbon dioxide? CO2, right? Carbon, 1, 2 oxygens, 3 atoms. So those are simple molecules, small molecules. They're not organic molecules, by the way, but typically organic molecules are macromolecules. They have thousands, if not millions of atoms. In case of DNA, trillions of atoms, all right? So organic molecules typically are very large by comparison, but they're still super microscopic. We still need sophisticated instrumentation to see them and to detect them. And there are these 4 types. So it comes down to these 4 types of molecules that form life on Earth, organic life, in an organized coordination between them. All right. What else I want to say? Oh, yes. So the definition of an organic molecule, whatever molecule it is, all right, it has carbon and hydrogen, not just carbon, but carbon and hydrogen. Needs to have for an organic molecule, for a molecule to be organic, to be classified as organic, needs to have carbon and hydrogen, minimum. And perfect example, glucose, right, has 6 C6H12O6, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, right? And it's kind of deceiving because carbon dioxide is a product of respiration. We would think that carbon dioxide is an organic molecule. It's missing hydrogen. Water, there's no life without water, but water has no carbon, so water is not an organic molecule, okay?
So methane would be organic.
Yes,
Methane
CH, exactly. CH4, no? Exactly. So methane, yes. And it is a product, it's a gas that is a product of an organic reaction. But CO2 and H2O are also products, depending if we're looking at respiration or photosynthesis, right? They're either the starting material or the products of organic reactions that are the basis of life, precisely, between photosynthesis and respiration is the balance of life in nature at the molecular level. Okay, so they're known as macromolecules because they are made up with thousands or millions of atoms. And they're huge by comparison to other molecules, but they're still super, super microscopic, okay? We understand that. A little bit more on the language, just to be on the same page. Now, units. And so life on Earth is water-based. And that's why it's so fascinating when the astronomers find some evidence of water outside planet Earth. Moon has water underneath, has frozen water. Maybe that's why the Chinese are on the dark side of the moon, or the Russians are on the dark side of the moon. There's frozen water under the moon, which has tremendous potential for doing stuff, or establishing a chemical factory up there somehow, or mining it. But water is necessary for life in its liquid state. So we have 3 states of matter. There's 4 states of matter, but the ones that we're most familiar with, gas, liquid, solid, right? And we can change the state of matter simply by adding or subtracting either heat or pressure. The most common one is heat, so we can go from gas to liquid to solid if we subtract heat, right? Or if we add to ice, we add heat, we liquefy it. If we continue to add heat to that liquid, we vaporize water vapor, which is hot and it's painful and it's dangerous because you can get a nice burn out of it. So we gotta be careful with water vapor. And the scale, that is a centigrade scale, is gonna be a base 10 scale, all right? From 0 to 100. It's based on the change of state of water. From solid to liquid at 0 degrees, and from liquid to gas at 100 degrees. All right, so that established what is known as the centigrade scale, also known as the Celsius scale, because this fellow Celsius, who was some kind of, I think, a Greek way back, came up with this, realizing that water was so basic in life, and liquid water, that he just gave it a decimal or a centigrade scale.
What was the 4th?
Yes,
state?
plasma. The plasma state, but the plasma tends to be unstable, all right? For example, the sun is a plasma state.
The permafrost would be...
Perma is solid water. Solid water. That, yeah, but ice also, ice flows, you know, very slowly, but it flows. For example, an ice, up in the mountains, the mountain ranges, the things that are melting, glaciers flow very slowly, thousands of years.
One's gonna break pretty soon.
Yeah, yeah, it's all kind of stuff happening. The glaciers carved out the Great Lakes, for example. It's estimated that glaciers going forth and receding carved out the Great Lakes, deepest lakes in the world. All right, just by the movement of that ice grinding over thousands of years, grinding the surface of the earth, the crust. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This gives us the temperature. I'm going to fellow. Oh, there's Celsius. Okay, 1700s. Okay. For some reason, I associated Celsius with Greek, in ancient Greece. All right, so we have, it's part of the modern science then, right, to establish a standard. When we translate it to Fahrenheit, because the UK has to have its own system, you know, they're British, and so they will not go decimal, no matter what. Even if they have to Brexit, they will not go decimal. It was actually the size of the king, right? So the foot was the actual size of the king, which I think is a little exaggerated, 12 inches was the foot of the king. And the pulgar, the inch, was the size of the thumb, in Spanish, el pulgar, which is the thumb of the king. That's the inch. Mm-hmm. And Fahrenheit was this fellow Fahrenheit who invented the scale, but it's obviously not decimal, and it's not based on water because freezing of water is 32 Fahrenheit, and the boiling of water is 212 Fahrenheit. And there's no decimality between those two numbers, right? So it's based on something else. I think it's actually based on mercury somehow. Okay, but those are the Fahrenheit equivalents. And there's a little formula, 5/8 times 32 plus 32 to make the equivalency. All right, so just a little reference to the primitive atmosphere. This is an anticipation of the lecture when we're going to talk about the origin of life, organically, materially speaking. How do we get from inorganic molecules to organic molecules? It turns out that there were some organic molecules in the primitive atmosphere already, right? And so the precursors are going to be these 4 molecules in gas: water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen. Very different from the composition of our atmosphere today. This type of atmosphere for us would be extremely toxic, and we couldn't have the life that we have today. And again, I'm going to wait until we get to that lecture, just a few lectures forward. But these are the elements that were forming the primitive atmosphere. Already we talked about this. All right, human origins. For the rest of the course, we're going to be gearing toward looking at the human origin. But I can tell you just in anticipation, we diverge from the chimp. Well, first of all, we get the tribe of hominins. The tribe is below order, class, order, family. Under family, we get tribe. It's like a subcategory of family, just above genus. All right, so tribe is between family and genus, if you will. And our hominin tribe diverged from the southern apes, known as Australopithecus, about 8 million years ago, more or less, according to the fossil record. We diverged from the chimp line about 6 million years ago. And the Homo genus itself, genus, not a level of species yet, but the genus, all right, this would include what we would call like cousins to our Homo sapiens, about 3 million years ago. And what is known as anatomically modern man, in other words, a human that we would see indistinguishable from any of us, only about 200,000 years ago. much less than 1 million years ago. All right. So this is already pointing out, this just by the fossil record what's available, approximate numbers. And this tells us that in between here, from 3 million years to 200,000 years ago, there were other Homo species that were not Homo sapiens. And so we have at least about half a dozen of them, up to a dozen, depending on how we classify them. But these are the other Homos of which we have some fossil record that were not sapiens, all right? Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, which means erect, standing, then erectus, Georgicus from the region of what is today Georgia in Eastern Europe, Heidelbergensis from Heidelberg in Germany, Neanderthalis, which coincided with sapiens in Europe for about 10 to 20,000 years. And then others, if you remember a few years ago, the miniature human that was found in the island of Flores in the South Pacific. That one is called Florensis. They're like midgets, they're pygmies, all right? The Hobbit, yes, Hobbit man. Anyway, these are by their scientific classification part of the Homo, the genus Homo, but not sapiens. And the big question is, did they have a soul or not, right? Okay, some characteristics of the genus. Bipedal, the brain size at least twice as large as the closest relative, which are going to be the Australopithecines. To harness fire, which is a big technological leap, if you will, because then the first thing that was used was double thing for fire, harnessing, controlling fire. No other species has been able to control fire. In fact, the typical reaction to fire from any other species is to flee as fast as possible because it burns them up, all right? But we got so daring and so curious that we actually started playing with fire, our ancestors, and we found two advantages. First, for protection, because if we do a campfire or we do a ring of fire around us, it will keep the other creatures away, and we're safer in the middle of the forest or the grassland, because the others flee. They're not stupid like us. They flee from fire. And then occasionally the ones that didn't flee and got caught up in fire, we noticed that they were more tasty. They got cooked. And that starts the digestive process. So we gain much more energy out of our food. We gain much more nutrition out of our food by cooking it, right? And we cook it with fire. And so the two big advantages for our ancestors in the hominin line was to harness fire for protection and for nourishment.
And then the theory is, I think, that because of the nutrition, that the gut actually becomes more specialized and smaller, but it allows the brain size to develop. That's one aspect, and the other aspect is going bipedal, freeing the hands to synergize, because these becomes our first tools, our hands, now that we don't have to use it for walking. They're not that out, Maggie?
I had also read that by cooking the food, it was softer and it was easier. It softened the jawline.
Yes.
In terms of physical.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and made it smaller and narrower and so forth. Yes. To this day, the strongest bone in our body is still the masseter, right? And the one on the jaw. So that's why it's dangerous to get a human bite, because it can break through. But it's definitely much smaller than the other carnivores.
The opposable thumb,
right?
Does that come under the?
Not necessarily, because the other primates, they also have a semi-opposable thumb, all right? So they can either grasp this way or they can grasp this way. And that's why it used to be originally thought that the opposable thumb was, but now we've seen further observations of chimps especially, but also gorillas, that they can grasp opposing. And so it's not unique.
Foot too, right?
Yes.
So when did man lose that on their foot?
Bipedal. When we went bipedal, when we became, actually bipedal is a consequence of getting an S shape on our spine that can center of gravity. I'll talk more about that a little later.
I've heard that the big toe is very important in balancing.
Yes, in fact, all the toes. Yeah, the big one in particular, but all of the toes. So at one point I figured, well, in light of athlete's foot and stuff that can happen with the toes, and it's so difficult to cut my toenails, why don't we just cut off the toes? You know, but we won't be able to walk. We'll be bumping into stuff. Yes, exactly. And so the toes refine our walking, even within the shoe. They refine our walking, the sensitivity of the pressure refines our walking to be able to walk straight, literally. Otherwise we'll be bumping and stuff. Right? So there's still a function for the toes.
Well, not only that, I mean, even today when they talk about running, there was a real theory for people either running barefoot or running with shoes. And there is something they talk about, certain people, like their feet actually, how they move and how they.
Yes, the gait, right? The running gait. In fact, I don't know if to this day, for many years, the marathon runners and always the gold medals in the Olympics were these barefoot Africans that would spend their lifetime running, you know, and they were barefoot. And so the big thing back, I think it was 68, because we were living in Mexico City and the Olympics were in Mexico City at that time, was whether or not to allow them to run barefoot, if it was considered or that they'd have to wear shoes, because all their life they train barefoot, they walk barefoot, they live barefoot, and for using shoes would hinder them tremendously. But barefoot, they would outrun any other runner.
Did they let them run barefoot?
They did. Yeah. Okay. Clothing is another one. Clothing, I have a lot to say about clothing later. I'm not going to hold on to it, but we're the only species that uses clothing. And I'll leave it at that for now. Lithic technology. Lithic is a reference to rock, to stone, right? Not just using stone, but making stone tools. Making stone tools, not just using stones or using tools, but making tools. Okay, symbolic language. This gets into culture, and then the human soul, right? When do we posit the possibility of the human soul? That would really be the phylogenetic of the human species, the origin, right? And that, again, we see the direct intervention of God, because our parents gave us the genetics, but they didn't give us a soul. Our parents are incapable of creating a soul, right? And that's truly where so I reserve the word creation strictly in its formal meaning of a creator who is himself unmoved, but he is the cause of everything else that moves. All right, I think we are at the break. If you have questions, comments.
It's fascinating. Regarding language, do you think that it evolved at the genus level of Homo, or is any possibility anatomically, given that at least in the emission of complex sounds by convergence in other groups has evolved? Like
exactly. Many other animals have sound, right? And songs, very elaborate songs. They're either mating songs or danger songs and so forth. The blue jays, they're raucous. Every time we walk around here, they just because we're invading their territory, okay? And it must mean something to them. But yeah, so that's why I say symbolic language or symbolic culture, not just the language itself, because many other animals have language, all right? But symbolic
language, I mean.
This is what I mean by symbolic language. Triangle. When I say triangle, we all have a mental picture of triangle. It's going to have 3 sides and 3 angles necessarily. It could be isosceles, it could be equilateral, you name it. It could be a right triangle, many different shapes, sizes, etc. But it's going to be triangle. It's not going to be a square or a circle. I say triangle to a lizard, doesn't have a clue. I say triangle to a chimp, doesn't have a clue. It's abstract language.
But danger. Animals understand danger and they have a language for it, and is that symbolic?
They understand it, but, okay, I don't know is a short answer, all right? Because I'm not that into anthropology and there's a whole science that studies the language of animals, all right? And primates. And they may have a level of symbolic language, but it's nowhere near the sophistication that we have, where we can actually transmit abstract thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I know that Coco was that gorilla that was trained to establish, to use, I think, what was it, maybe 100 words or something like that she could understand from the human, or symbolic, right? So it's something, and that's a percentage homology. After all, with the chimp, we have 99% homology on the DNA, 99%. With the gorilla, it's 98%.
Like if you look at elephants, when they're studying elephants, that they have a concept of mourning a family when someone
Some
dies.
level.
Some level, but
yes.
If they can go back to a place where they mourn, they know
yes.
another member has died, and go back to the space and mourn. So that has got to be some concept of understanding. And
yeah, dolphins also, it can be very challenging for the mother dolphin to lose a newborn because she has to train. So breathing from the surface is an acquired behavior. And the mammals, the sea mammals, need to learn that behavior, otherwise they'll drown. They'll asphyxiate, they'll suck in water from the blowhole if they don't go up to the surface. So one of the first things that the mother dolphin has to do, or the mother whale, when she gives birth, is to go under the newborn and push that newborn to the surface so that they can have their first breath, all right? And it's an instinct of the mother to do that. If that newborn dies, that mother dolphin will continue to push that cadaver up to the surface for hours and sometimes for days. And it has been documented that some mother dolphins have become emaciated from the days of getting that, because the maternal instinct is so hardwired that they're getting that cadaver baby up to the surface, and in the meantime not feeding or doing anything else and just getting exhausted from that until she finally realized this baby is dead. And then we'll let it go to the bottom, like so. But how much of it is instinct and how much of it is cognitive behavior?
Something in between.
Nature nurture is the interaction, right? It's not either or. It's not antagonistic, it's collaborative.
It could be something in between. There's a gradation of stuff.
That's right. Yes.
Discrete.
That's what we call a dynamic system. A dynamic system. And again, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I know that there are behaviorists that study animal behavior and even study human behavior from the animal perspective, comparative behavior. Okay, so again, just a smattering of things, but this is part of the language, and we're going to get into this aspect. And for the humans, so for the genus, all of these together. So not just any one of them is sufficient, okay, but all of them coming together. So again, the dynamics that you're talking about. Maria, we're going to take a break. It's 11:20. So let's take about a 15-minute break, more or less. All right. And we'll come back and regroup. And restrooms are on either side. And donuts, courtesy of Siobhan. I'm going to pause the recording.